I believe so.
Okay. So I think we're going to get started. Good evening. I'm Jerry Jennings, and I serve as president of Great Falls Rising. Great Falls Rising Incorporated is a nonpartisan progressive movement that empowers individuals and connects communities while fostering equality, diversity, human rights, civil liberties, and a sustainable future through respectful dialogue, education, and advocacy. As stated in the invitation to join us, there are few events in the history of the state of Montana that can equal what happened in the early and mid 1970s to involve and include the citizens of our great state. When the people of Montana gathered in Helena for 54 days to produce a constitution, it got done. Great Falls Rising welcomes you to join us for a step back in history and a celebration of the 1972 Constitutional Convention with the folks who made it happen. You'll hear stories about an outdated constitution dating from 1889 when Montana gained statehood, citizens who wanted fairness and transparency, 100 delegates who came together from all walks of life and worked diligently to provide a new day for Montana, and a fight to get the Constitution voted for by the citizens. It's exciting and it's history. I have worked for the past 2 months with many people to produce this evening's program, and I want to honor and thank Arlene Riker, delegate from Great Falls, for providing hours of consultation for me, including people who participated, dates and facts, complete with the drama and excitement that took place in the early 70s in Helena and all over Montana. I also thank Shannon Wilson for her tireless support, as you can see tonight, technical and creative aspects of producing this Zoom event. This program is being recorded and will be posted tomorrow on our website, greatfallsrisingmt.org. Also, a message from the Montana Historical Society is, if you're an educator who would like to earn OPI renewal units for attending this program, please follow the link that we will send you tomorrow. There are several other events that are coming up to celebrate the work of the 1972 Constitutional Convention, including one at MSU on March 22nd, all culminating with a 2-day celebration in Helena on June 15th and 16th. Stay tuned for the dates. They'll have been posted on the Great Falls Rising website and in our social media. I have been billing this evening's program as an event with the original, quote, cast of characters, unquote. We are so fortunate to have 9 speakers, 8 for participants in this seminal event. I only wish I could have joined them. Tonight I will. We'll begin our 1972 reminiscences with Dorothy Bradley and Bob Brown, both legislators at the time, who will set the stage for the event. And Dorothy and Bob, you're on.
Thanks.
Hi, Dorothy.
Hi, Bob. There.
Am I starting?
Yes.
Okay. All right. The 1972 Montana Constitution is widely regarded as, if not the greatest, perhaps one of the greatest constitutions in the United States from any state. And it was written by grassroots citizens. Current office holders at the time were prohibited from running for the Constitutional Convention or obviously then serving. And it convened on January 17th, 1972 and adjourned on March 24th, 1972. So it was in process exactly 100 years ago from right now. And it contains 12,000 words. The 1889 Constitution that it replaced was twice as verbose. It contained 24,000 words. And a large reason for the fact that the 1889 Constitution was so much more wordy was that it focused on all kinds of details that were left up to the legislature in the 1972 Constitution. The 72 Constitution was focused more on principles and broad guidelines, and it placed greater emphasis on accountability of government. Some examples from the 1889 Constitution are, it went into a detailed description of government printing and binding procedures. It contains a constitutional requirement of an appointed office of the state examiner, which of course is a bureaucratic and appointed office. It doesn't even exist anymore. Detailed description of the Board of Pardons. What am I doing here? And it goes into numbing detail on the flow of information that takes place between the governor's departments and the governor. Detailed description of the administrative duties and functions of the State Prison Commission. And I think something like 5 pages outlining the various types and kinds of corporations in Montana. And so it's pretty clear, I think, when you read it, that to say it's not very progressive is an understatement. And it was written in 1889 by an element of our state population that was very powerful in terms of money and investments. And the chairman of the president, rather, of the 1889 Constitutional Convention was the Copper King, William Andrews Clark. And so it's sometimes referred to as the Copper Collar Constitution. Now, it also made it almost impossible, virtually impossible, to tax mining property. That's an example of Clark's domination, I think. And so it was sorely needed to be replaced. In fact, just a couple of things I did want to mention that are kind of shocking, really, that show how out of date it is. If I can find them here. Yeah. Women shall be eligible to hold the office of county school superintendent or any school district office and shall have the right to vote in any school district elections. Well, that was because there wasn't, women hadn't been granted the franchise at that time. And then this one's kind of a horrible one. The 1889 Constitution says no idiot or insane person shall be entitled to vote in any election. And you can draw your own conclusions about that if you think about it today too, I guess. The 1972 Constitution is really a wonderful document, and it contains a detailed declaration of human rights, something that isn't even remotely touched on by the 1889 Constitution. We're guaranteed the right of individual dignity. We're guaranteed the right as citizens to complete participation in the functions of government in our state. We're guaranteed the right to know. Notably now, we're guaranteed the right to privacy. We're guaranteed the right to bear arms. We're guaranteed the rights of persons not adults is guaranteed in the Constitution. That's unique in the country, I think. We have made the state subject to lawsuits, so the king can do wrong if he loses in court. We've given full rights to, the full rights are restored by people who are, they're no longer under supervision and convicted of any offense against the state. So they can once you get out of jail and pay your fine, you can vote and participate as a regular citizen, not the case in many constitutions. And well, I think I can't keep track of my organization here. Here we go. The governor's granted an item veto. That's not so much in the category of human rights, but it shows how it streamlined government. And it creates tax appeals boards. It creates an apportionment committee, so the legislature no longer handles that chore, and we're seeing some of what's going on there right now. And it contains the provision about a clean and healthful environment, which I think Dorothy's going to talk a little bit more about. All lands distributed by the taking of natural resources shall be reclaimed. And that's been an important provision. So I think what I'd like to do is close with a story that illustrates what happened in the first legislative session, or the last legislative session under the old Constitution. It was in 1971, and Dorothy Bradley and I were both members of that Constitution. And just briefly, I know we're limited in time. In fact, how much time do I have left, Jerry? Do you know?
Jerry, how much time does he have left? Asking.
Couple, 3 minutes?
A couple minutes,
How much?
2 minutes.
Well, anyway, I'll be as quick as I can be. Dorothy Bradley and I were in the 1971 session of the legislature, which was the last session under the old Constitution. And there was a very controversial bill before the legislature called the Territorial Integrity Bill. It's no longer an issue, but it was a hot issue then. And so a member of the legislature from up on the Highland line by the name of Ed Smith, Big Ed Smith, who later ran for governor, decided to propose an amendment to an agreement that had perhaps been reached by the Sun River Co-op and the Montana Power Company. And Smith's feeling and the co-op's feelings were that the compromise was weighted heavily in favor of Montana Power Company. So he proposed this amendment on second reading, which is the debate stage in the legislature. And there was a pretty heated back and forth discussion on the floor. And when the vote was called, it was really close, essentially a tie vote. And then the co-ops prevailed by one vote after a member changed his vote. And right when that took place, the members of the House of Representatives were all focused up on the voting board. And as they were, we saw this big flash that came from the gallery in the back of the House chamber. And that was someone who took a picture with one of those big old flash bulb cameras of the voting board. And then he turned and ran out of the Capitol building, and the Speaker of the House ordered the Sergeant at Arms, there were a couple of them, in fact, to catch that guy. Well, you might wonder, well, why was that the case? Well, under the 1889 Constitution, one of many defects in it was that the vote on second reading, the debate on second reading, was not a vote of record. So the people at home could never know how their legislators voted on that debate stage of the bill. And if the bill didn't pass second reading, it couldn't go on to third reading and therefore become law. And so 2 years later, well, actually a year later, I guess, in 1972, Article 5, Section 10 of the state constitution we have now, the 72 Constitution, says every vote of each member of the legislature on each substantive question in the legislature, in any committee of the legislature, or in the committee of the whole shall be recorded and made public. And the next day, the voting board, how the members voted, the ayes and nays, was published in the Rural Electric Co-op publication. And then of course it was picked up in the press around the state. And there were a number of legislators that I understand were deeply embarrassed by that, because they'd maybe been talking out of one side of their mouth and were prepared to vote on the other side of their mouth, didn't think they'd get caught. That's not a problem in the new Constitution. And just that one little provision is so important to the people having a real control over their government, having real knowledge of what their government does. It's related to the open meeting law in terms of extreme importance. So when you're drinking your cocktail tonight, hoist one to the 1972 Constitution.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. And you know, what excites me, folks, is how excited all these people are to be telling about this wonderful thing. So next we have Dorothy Bradley, who also was a legislator at the time. And Dorothy, you're on.
Jerry, give me the hand when I'm to 10 minutes.
Will do.
I have been enjoying this. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay. I have been enjoying this. Jerry, I just want to thank you for putting the Constitution up on the flagpole this year. We all know that it's in jeopardy. This is the year to celebrate all the amazing provisions that we have in that Constitution and just laud it as hard as we can. And this is the first group, Great Falls Rising, that is doing that. When I was in my first session in 1971, we were busy implementing executive reorganization. We are setting the Constitutional Convention in motion. We set out a special session to elect delegates, which was a big deal because legislators weren't allowed to run. And I can remember a lot of people being sort of offended at that idea because they didn't know how something that extraordinarily complicated could happen without them. And I even remember a huge battle in one of the special sessions to defeat the sales tax. And I wouldn't even mention that, except it involved huge intrigue, hidden documents, digging things out of garbage cans and things like that. We don't need to worry about that today because of our rights to know and the preservation of documents. There are so many different things, but there Bob and I were back in 1971, quite thriving under the old system. We had multiple member districts. For me, that was that I had to campaign for a district of 4 all the way from Bozeman to West Yellowstone. But it meant that people could vote for me and, oh yeah, those 3 other people. And amazingly, I made it in. We had closed executive sessions. Turn out the press at the end of the public hearing. Just turn them out, turn out the public. We'll decide this in secret. We had non-recorded votes, as Bob has talked about. And we had no notice of hearings. I mean, you just plunked them in here and there whenever you wanted to get the stuff done. But of course, it didn't really matter then because we didn't have a lot of citizens around the state who were focusing in. We just had a bunch of corporate lobbyists up there who were up there anyway, and they would know when the hearings were. So we were fairly calm doing that. But a year later, 1972, I was quite riveted on the Constitutional Convention. And I watched it and occasionally went up and watched it from the galleries. Here's an interesting thing. Almost 1/5 of the delegates this woman, Republican in the Senate, Tony Roselle. But suddenly 15 women are constitutional, or almost 1/5 of almost 20 delegates were women. It was remarkable. I think when it turned out legislators couldn't run, all these people out there said, why not me? And they all ran and they won. The delegates were seated alphabetically. I couldn't believe that. We fought long and hard over who was going to sit where. They were represented by leaders from both parties. I mean, the dazzling Leo Graybill from Great Falls and the somber and learned Mayor John Toole from Missoula. I mean, in the legislature, we didn't have a speaker and a vice speaker. No. And then at the end, they all signed the document and went across the state to promote it. I had never seen such a thing. When we were in the legislature, we'd come home and go to Rotary in Kiwanis, and we'd have, if you were in the majority, you had to defend everything that happened, and you get beat upon by the opposition and vice versa. You know, I mean, it was a new business model. I wish that we had paid more attention to that business model, and we still could do that today. But as far as the provisions, they held us to the law. It's the constitutional law, and it's so incredible. Some of you know that I compiled a book recently that was released as a law review from the University of Montana Law School from about 20 different writers about the brilliance of the 20s. And I think back of we call it the glory days. It was environmental inspiration, to be sure. But I have to say, thank you, Maynan, Bob Campbell, and all of you who were there. The inspiration was absolutely lodged in the Constitution, the preamble, and also the provision on a right to clean and healthful environment. I look at that preamble to this day, and I wish we could read it every time we recite the Declaration of Independence, because it defines who we are. And it was a whole new thing about who we are. It defined us within the landscape of Montana. that is sacred and that we are accountable to handing that on to future generations. You know, it's not just about us in the here and now, but we are accountable to passing that on. And that is the basket you gave us for the disorganized but very productive time in the 70s to pass legislation. I was just going to remember one or mention one thing about the water provision in there, because it was quite specific. And for much of the latter 20 years after this time, we talked about water. And if I remember, it was very controversial in the passage of the Constitution, and the Farm Bureau raised the issues and so forth. Where would we be today, particularly in a time of mega drought, without those centralized records? And the Constitution said, you will create a system of centralized records. So there was two other things I wanted to mention about implementing, because we who came in the session following the legislature, and of course we blew it because we had a one chance at annual sessions, and everybody was so horrified that we showed up that often that they discontinued annual sessions. But we had various interim studies that implemented incredible things. One is the individual dignity clause, no discrimination by the state or a private entity on the basis of a multitude of things, race, religion, and so forth, but also sex, gender. So the legislature put a huge study in place, the Equality of Sexes study, chaired by this incredibly somber, smart, easygoing lawyer from Livingston, Dan Yardley. Never a wrinkle of unhappiness. It just happened, and all those bills passed about custody, about mutual support, about bank credit, about prostitution and patrons. All this material passed under his calm purview. You know, outside, the place was raging over the controversies of the Equal Rights Amendment. We bypassed that completely. I never know why it happens or why it doesn't. But the second that did not avoid that kind of controversy was over local government. And Dale Harris, the brilliant, truly brilliant person who ran the Constitutional Convention, headed up the local government studies. And it was wild to the point where I remember people bringing in this huge tomb of local government and placing it on the desk of Representative Harold Gerke, saying this will not, well, it was awful and it was ugly, although not compared to what we see in this day and age. And we got it passed in bits and pieces, not in one big clump. But don't forget that this Constitution is a living document. And to this day, it requires local governments to do a 10-year review of what they're doing to see if they could do better. And it also holds out this totally unused opportunity of a self-governing charter. And if you don't like what the state tells you to do, you can go home and write your own. And I don't think anybody has done that, which is a real. And what a celebration. We could go on and on.
Thank you, Dorothy. You can see the excitement, the hard work, the passion that went into this. So now I'm going to ask Nancy Leifer, who is president of the League of Women Voters of Montana, and they saw a need. Nancy?
Thank you, Jerry. My name's Nancy Leifer, and I am president of the League of Women Voters of Montana. And I don't understand if you all can see me. Can you see me right now? Or is it still on? You can. Okay, thanks, Bob. So yes, I'm the president of the League of Women Voters right now in Montana. And I have to say, unlike all the other speakers that we are going to be hearing tonight, or at least most of them, I actually was not part of this whole effort back in 1970, 1971, but I was part of the local government study that took place a few years later. I worked as a public participation person on that. So I have a little bit of a claim to being able to be part of this amazing movement that happened to bring Montana out of its distant past and into its glorious future. So what I'm going to tell a story of what made the Constitutional Convention possible in 1972, and the role of women and how that came to be. You know, as recently as the 1940s and the 1950s, Montana was characterized as a colony in a book published in 1947, a very popular book called Inside America. The book claimed that Montana is the nearest thing to a colony of any American state. And of course, they were referring to the dominance of the Anaconda Copper Mining Company in Montana. And one of the reasons that they said this was that at the time, the Anaconda Company owned all but one of the major newspapers in the state. And so they had a lock not just on local government, but on government, but also on news. In 1957, the magazine The Economist noted that because of this dominance over the newspaper field, that Montana readers were the worst informed about their own affairs than the inhabitants of almost any other state. And you know, Bob and Dorothy have already described the older Constitution and how things went under there as an example of how completely integrated the mining interests were into the way that government operated. There was an attempt in 1959 by the newly formed Legislative Council to track down just exactly where the 5 printed bills that were routinely made of any bills that were under consideration, where they all went. And they were able to track down 4 of them, going to places that you would assume like committee chairs and enrollers and engrossers and that sort of thing. But they finally tracked down where the 5th copy went. It went to the Anaconda Company. So that's an amazing degree of integration of corporate interests into how Montana was running its government as recently as 1959. So what changed to bring about all of what we've been hearing about and to bring about this wonderful Constitution that we have now? Well, the first thing that happened, and this goes back a little ways, is that World War II and the GI Bill really fundamentally changed the makeup of who Montanans were. The sons and daughters that were in the war came back as vets, and they had access to higher education, and their expectations were different than were the ones of their parents. The state economy was diversifying after World War II. We had a lot more going on than we had before, and that kind of led to the breakup of the strong alliance between the mining interests and the agricultural interests in the state. And then in 1959, the Anna Company sold its newspapers to Lee Enterprises, and we began to see the rise of independent journalism in Montana beyond just the Great Falls Tribune. Now, let me just take a moment here for any of those of you who are fairly new, or maybe not new, the younger people among us who are watching, just to remind everyone that in 1972, we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have an internet. There were only 3 major television networks, and that was only if you had reception good enough to get all 3, and not all of us did. Then there was radio and there were newspapers, and all 3 of those media sources were regulated by the federal government. They had to carry news on all sides of the issue, and they had to base their news on facts, and they were not divided into partisan camps like our media sources are today. And as a result, there was a high level of trust in the media back then. So let me just give an example of what happened, and I think Dorothy alluded to it earlier. There was a campaign to do a sales tax, and the campaign ended up with a slogan that was, the slogan for the campaign was "Save Our State." And of course, it was geared to try to get people to say, oh man, we've got to save the state, we got to vote for a sales tax. Well, the investigative journalists looked behind the scenes to see who it was that was actually funding this campaign. And lo and behold, it turned out to be the big corporations who stood the most to gain by shifting the tax burden away from themselves and onto consumers. But because that Montana now had free newspapers and that news could get out to people, that campaign to save our state went down in the 1968 election, and so did the politicians who supported it. So that not only got rid of that particular attempt to do a sales tax, but it also demonstrated to the people of Montana, hey, this is a new day. Corporate interests are no longer calling the tune as to what happens in Montana. So that happened. There was a reorganization of the executive branch that we alluded to earlier. And there was the rise of the environmental movement. At the same time, in the late 60s, it became clear that there was massive amounts of coal in eastern Montana that people were wanting to strip mine. And that the old Constitution did not give people much say over what was going on because it was so secretive and had so much of a influence from corporate lobbyists. So all of this set the stage for major changes that people wanted to see in Montana and made it, I think, all come together with what needed to be done to have a new constitution. Let me just share my screen for a minute. I wanted to just show a few pictures of some of the people who were involved in this and just share with you a little bit of an image of what this all was about. So the League of Women Voters was one of the organizations that was very instrumental. In fact, probably people would say, and it's not just me as a League member, but other people would probably say the same thing, that the League was probably, of all the various different citizens organizations involved, probably the most important one. We had 325 to 450 members at the time, and we were very much involved in campaigning for all aspects of getting this done here in Montana. The American Association of University Women were also very involved in this whole effort, passing for the rights of the Constitution and to get the new Constitution approved. And several of their members turned out to be delegates. Here are the 19 women delegates to the convention. As Dorothy mentioned earlier, almost 20% of the delegates were women. And this is in contrast to the fact that at the time, the legislature in Montana only had 2 women. So this was not only a major step forward in terms of women being involved, but here again is a picture of the whole entire delegation of delegates in the convention hall. To that point, having that many women involved was the most women had been involved in a constitutional convention at any time, anywhere in this country. So it was indeed a major step forward for women and for what was happening in Montana. So the League of Women Voters is an organization that has members at the time of this particular event. Only women could be members, but you did not have to have a college education to be a member. It was really a research and learning organization. The League did studies. We discussed the results of those studies. We read through them and then came to a consensus on what our position would be. And so we did that with the Montana Constitution. We had 2 League members in 1967 session who went up and tried to lobby in the legislature full time as citizen lobbyists and found it to be a very discouraging place for all those reasons that Dorothy mentioned about how things happened. And so the League determined to do its own study on constitutions, which they did in 1968. And they concluded that, yes, the Montana Constitution needed to be either rewritten or perhaps revised, but we needed a constitutional convention to take a good look at what was going on with our Constitution. And the League found, of course, the same areas of problems that Bob mentioned earlier, that the Constitution was way too specific. It should be more of a framework and not get into all the details, that it needed to have a Bill of Rights, which it did not have up to that point. And also that it needed to get rid of all the secrecy that went on in terms of how all of the committees met. And so the League pushed for initially the passage of a referendum bill by the 1969 legislature, which did pass the legislature. And that led to putting a referendum out to the people of the state, referendum 67, to have a constitutional convention. And the AAUW, including Louise Cross of Glendive, who was very much involved, and the Business and Professional Women Organization, as well as the League, all of them started to work to try to help the people of Montana understand why it was important to pass referendum 67. They had, I know a story of 2 League members who spent their entire summer of 1970 every weekend at a county fair in eastern Montana, manning a booth and talking to 4-H'ers and farmers. Back then, person-to-person contact was a really critical part of being able to reach people, in addition to the media sources I mentioned earlier. And so there was a lot of personal contact. Different women from these different organizations went out to talk to their neighbors, and we wrote flyers, newspaper articles, bumper stickers, pamphlets at fairs, malls, crazy day celebrations, everywhere we could find people. People went to try to pass out pamphlets and let people know what was going on. The League even created its own Montana Constitutional Convention Society. to be able to have an organization to focus just on helping people understand what was going on. Well, it did pass. It passed by a 2/3 vote of all of the places, of all the people in the state, that referendum to have a constitutional convention. And in fact, there were only 5 counties in which it didn't pass. So very successful effort. And one of our league members actually wrote the first in a series of booklets explaining what the convention was and what a constitution was, so that people could understand. So the league raised money to help with the campaign to get the actual constitution adopted once it was written, because the state Supreme Court had ruled that the extra money left over from the convention could not be used to try to help campaign to have it passed. And the league came up with this marvelous slogan. Well, I don't know if the league came up with it, but the slogan for this campaign was "Praise the Lord and pass the Constitution," which of course back then was a very stirring and great slogan to use to be able to get something like this through. And again, once the Constitution was written and the campaign was out there to get it passed, the women's organizations again were right on the front lines, setting up coffees for people to ask questions, booths in shopping centers, radio shows, letters to the editor, all of this to get it passed. So let me just end by saying that the Constitution passed by 2,532 votes out of 230,000 votes that were cast. And I would say it's fair to say that without women's organizations, and in particular the League and AAUW, we would not have the 1972 Constitution. Thank you.
Nancy, thank you very much. It's really exciting to see how people can be mobilized to do something that needs to be done. So thank you. Constitutional Convention historian Evan Barrett is next with his knowledge of commissions, management, and other roles.
Ask him to talk like he's on a football field, and maybe then we could hear
Hello.
better.
Hi.
But he's the coach at the end zone.
The discussion in the main room is taking over the camera there. I'm Evan Barrett, and I've kind of taken on the role of being a historian. Are you able to hear me, by the way? Thumbs up from anyone? Okay.
Just a little bit, that would be a big help. Thank you.
Pardon me?
Go over there. It's only over here.
Okay, I hope my microphone is picking this up.
It's good.
My name's Evan Barrett. I live in Butte now. For the last 40 years, I'm almost a Butte guy now. And I was living in Helena in 1972 and 1971. And I was the executive director of the Democratic Party at that time at a young age. And so when the Constitutional Convention came up and started after the sales tax election and after the delegates election, I wandered up to the Constitutional Convention and said, looked at some of my Democratic friends there and said, hey, we're here to see what's going on with this convention. And I was told that, you know, we're sitting here alphabetically. We're trying not to be partisan. Why don't you just not come up here and bother us? And well, I didn't. I watched from the sidelines to see what work they were doing, and it was fine work that was being done. In the last few years, I spent a lot of time working on the history of the convention and working on, obviously, this promotion that we're engaged in right now of celebrating the Constitutional Convention and the Constitution itself, which is a rather unique document. I'm going to not worry about my face. I'm going to put a share screen up here okay, where am I here? Here we are. So I'm going to let you look, instead of my face, look at a little bit of information. Montana has had actually 4 attempts to writing constitutions. The first actually was a pretty audacious attempt by the gentleman who rides the horse in front of the state capitol, Thomas Francis Meagher, who was our territorial governor. And he actually said, you know, we should be a state. Well, we were hardly even a territory, but he was very audacious, and he created a group, and they they wrote a constitution unauthorized by Congress, and they took off with that constitution, and they headed back east, and they got to St. Louis with it for printing it in St. Louis because it was handwritten, and it got lost. I think there may have been something going on late at night, a little frivolity, but it was lost and never seen again. So much for that Constitution. But in 1884, pre-statehood, there was an anticipation of us becoming a state, and a constitutional convention was held, and the president was the famous, infamous, or nefarious W.A. Clark, the Copper King from Butte. And he became the president of that convention with 45 delegates, who, by the way, as was at the time, were all men. And they produced a constitution, sent it to Congress, but we were not made a state, so it became irrelevant. So lo and behold, in 1889, there was a group of states in 1889 who were were declared states. And at that point, we had another convention, and Clark was again named the president of that convention. And again, it was all men, and they wrote the Constitution we lived under for 83 years, and the one that we really had to change to make Montana a state that was fair to its citizenry. So that brought us to the 1972 Constitution. We've been 83 years with the old Constitution. 100 delegates were elected in the election in multi-member districts. If you were, I think, in Great Falls, they elected 12 delegates from Great Falls. They elected 6 from Butte. They elected 12 or so, 13 from Billings, and so on. And all these delegates came together. They couldn't be legislators. They couldn't be mayors. They couldn't be anybody that held an elected office in Montana. And so the convention was called by 65% of the vote. 65, that's 2/3 vote. And it was held. And by the way, that picture you see on the slide is the president of the convention, Leo Graybill Jr., who was a real hero of that. Now, an interesting thing, of course, is that 65% of the people called the convention, but when it was all over and all the work was done, and then there was serious lobbying against the product, it won by only 2,500 votes, roughly. And that was because the powers that be were losing power under the new Constitution and weren't very happy about it, and they went out to kill it. Luckily, they didn't, and we've been able to have the benefits of that Constitution. So now, was mentioned before about the copper collar. We were the roots of the new Constitution in '72 came out of the old Constitution, which had led to too much corporate strength, as we mentioned, and now I'm just quickly hit these slides because Nancy's already mentioned them. Was that we were known nationwide as being the nearest thing to a corporate colony of any American state. In fact, the only other state that was close to us was Delaware, which had the same relationship to the DuPont Corporation, and that was it. Anaconda's control of Montana was enormous, and we had to get out from under that thing. And part of it was because of the press, and we were ill-informed, and the advent of a new press in 1959 helped set the stage for us in 1972 have a new Constitution. Ted Schwinden, former Governor Schwinden, pointed out that there was a real enlightenment happened in Montana through the 60s and the 50s and 60s, and that came out of World War II, where the people left the farm, went to war, saw the world, exchanged different things, came back with the GI Bill of Rights, got educated and informed and interested in things, and began to look at what was wrong with our government, a major portion of which was what was wrong with our legislature and the secretiveness that Bob mentioned. This was a study done by the 68 Legislative Council, a brand new thing, the Legislative Council at that time. They found that 48% of the sections of the old Constitution might be able to be kept, but they needed to be improved. That 20% needed to be substantially revised, and 32%, essentially 1/3 of the Constitution, needed to be thrown out or completely. So that set the stage for when the League of Women Voters put out that pamphlet and then got the referendum through the next legislature. At the time, the '69 legislature created a Montana Constitutional Revision Commission. Two people from Great Falls were on it. Senator Jack McDonald was the chairman, and Harry Mitchell, then a senator, and I think Harry may be with us tonight. They were from Great Falls on that commission. There's only two surviving members of that commission today. One is Harry, and one is Wade DeHood from Anaconda. Wade also, by the way, later ran for delegate and became a delegate. That commission hired a bunch of extraordinary researchers whose names are listed on this slide, who took on and wrote virtually books on each section of the Constitution or possible section to give the intellectual background and information for the delegates to work with. After the election was held, after the referendum, the 71 session created a Constitutional Convention Commission to set up the rules for the Constitution. Alexander Blewett of Great Falls was the chairman of that. Randall Swanberg from Great Falls was on that. There are no surviving members, by the way, of that Constitutional Convention Commission. They set up all the rules to set up the Constitution itself, and they set up the election. The election was held in multi-member districts. They were the same district legislators were held in. And, and so, like I said, in some cases, you were looking at 24 people running for 12 spots. It was a little bit awkward, not like single member district we have now. The result of that election, there were hundreds and 500 people that filed originally. The primary was in September, the general was in November, and when it was all said and done, there were 100 delegates, there were 58 Democrats, 36 Republicans, and 6 independents. So Democrats could get really excited about it, but the Constitutional Convention thought differently. And they said, you know what, we're going to share power. Leo Grable reached out to Jim Felt and to Marshall Murray, and had Marshall Murray head up the Rules Committee, and they agreed to share power and have everyone that was a chairman of a committee that was a Democrat had a vice chairman was a Republican, and the vice versa, and not all the and the Democrats didn't control all the committees, and so they sat alphabetically. Miraculously, they sat alphabetically, and after a few days and maybe a week, they forgot that the person next to them was a Democrat or Republican. They just knew it was another Montanan there to do a job, to build a constitution for the citizens of Montana. And so that right now, this is a list. I wanted everyone to see it. It's the last of the 100. There are 12 living delegates left. I won't go through them, but there 5 of them are on our presentation tonight, and they are, in my mind, giants in Montana history and real heroes for Montana and its citizenry. So at this point, it's time for me to let go and move on to hearing from some of the important people, which is the delegates who are with us tonight.
Isn't it wonderful hearing from historians? You know something, they're all historians because they were there. So Evan, thank you very much. It is our own Great Falls delegate, Arlene Reichert, and Arlene will talk about the structure of the convention. Arlene?
Yes, being a Constitutional Convention delegate is one of the highlights of my long life. Among my many blessings, including a wonderful family and friends, are my fellow delegates, 99 of them. When we first gathered in the Montana Legislative House chambers with a magnificent Charlie Russell mural looking down on us, little did I dream what we would accomplish. 7 years later, I sat in that very same chamber, having been elected to the state legislature. In both cases, I was one of 100 Montanans elected. However, the experience was totally different because of structure. The first time, was inspiring. I helped write the Montana Constitution. The second time I was a legislator from Cascade County, there were hardworking people in both governing bodies. There were passionate stances and long days. I left the Constitutional Convention energized. I left the legislature exhausted. Most importantly, those running as delegates, as you heard before, could not be elected officials, which resulted in folks, including 19 women from all walks of life, being elected. Though we ran on party labels, just like the legislators, we made the unusual decision to sit alphabetically, as you heard, instead of being divided by the aisle in confrontational style. This simple act fostered human connection. At the end of the convention, as was said before, many of us did not even know the political party of the other delegates. It was a great time. And at the end of, without partisan influence, we based our decisions on the merits of each issue. Although there were no professional lobbyists, we did seek broad opinions of citizens throughout the state via the well-publicized public hearings. We had a lot of public hearings. Another huge difference in structure was that the Constitutional Convention was a unicameral or one-house body. The legislature, being comprised, of course, of both a House and a Senate, means that every piece of legislation goes through a lengthy, complicated process. As a result, all 100 Constitution Convention delegates knew what was going on throughout the process. It was often speculated that if there had been another chamber down the hall, the Constitution would not have been written. During the convention, every issue was discussed by the relevant committee with a majority and minority report presented to the entire convention. There were many opportunities to debate each issue and even to reconsider it before the final vote. With the cumbersome structure of the legislature, after a bill is passed by either the House or Senate, as you know, it must pass over for the same action in the other house by the dreaded transmittal deadline. That 45th day is horrendous. What a nightmare. It was just chaotic. In my case as a legislator, I actually had a bill pass overwhelmingly in the House, but when it reached the Senate, neither I nor my colleague of the opposite party could find it. It was shunted from one committee to the other, so we could not testify for it, and it died in committee. As far as serving in the state legislature today is concerned, I do have tremendous respect for people who put themselves out there for the process. I believe there was never a more urgent time for brave, conscientious people to run for public office on both sides of the aisle. I just wish that the legislators would adopt a simple rules change to sit alphabetically. Among others, Carla Gray, who was a former Chief Justice of the Montana Supreme Court, advocated strongly for alphabetical seating of the legislature. Do you think it could ever happen? Convention was not without humor. One of the funniest moments early on came, it was during the orientation, and we decided to forget about political party politics. Betty Babcock expressed the opinion shared by all of the women delegates that we did not like being addressed as Madam Delegate. Throughout the orientation, it would be differentiated. Male delegates would just be called delegate. Madam Delegate, we just didn't like it. So Betty suggested that in addition to getting rid of political party labels, we also get rid of sex on the floor. There was a roar of laughter, but Our gracious President Leo Graybill handled the situation in his usual wise manner. Leo was a perfect leader throughout the convention. He stated in the very beginning that debate would never be cut off, and he kept his word. That resulted in many late night sessions, as well as meeting on Saturdays. Leo was consistently fair, and he had a dry wit, which was vital. One day on the floor, a delegate asked if, after a lawyer spoke, someone could please explain in layperson's terminology exactly what the lawyer said. Leo responded, that would be an impossible task. We were given 60 days to produce a new constitution, and many believed that that would be an impossible task. However, because of the structure, we were able to write the new document in 54 days and actually give money back to the state. It was unheard of, but we did it. Every issue was thoroughly discussed, and we wound up with a number of outstanding improvements, including single-member districts instead of at-large voting. Dorothy Bradley referred to that. It makes a big difference when you can visit with every person in your district. And we also established a Reapportionment Commission. That was a big deal because every session of the legislature after a census, much of the time was devoted to talking about districts. Gerrymandering ruled supreme. Each legislator tried to protect his or his district because it was very, very difficult. The final document has so many innovative provisions, some of which you will hear about from other speakers tonight. I believe Maynan is going to talk about the right to a clean and healthy environment. And Louise Cross was our chairman of the Natural Resources Committee. You know, under Leo's leadership, the delegates really felt involved in every decision. It's true, each of us did not get everything we wanted in the final document, but every idea was explored and the majority prevailed in every case. It was a great relief when each of the 100 delegates signed the Constitution. I'll never forget that day. Perhaps we succeeded in writing a great Constitution because we dealt with large issues, not the legislative line items. We knew we had one shot to do this. I'm sure that alphabetical seating helped. Having a lot of women delegates made our governing body more balanced. Other factors were there was no campaigning for re-election, allowing delegates to follow our heads and our hearts instead of considering a future election and maybe donors' wallets. We didn't have that to think about. Perhaps we can chalk a bit of the success of Montana's Constitution to beginner's luck, because as you know, anyone who held elective office at the time was ineligible to run as a delegate. We had a lot of people in our group, among 100 delegates, who perhaps didn't realize what we could not do, so we did it. Although we worked diligently far into the night, we did take time to invite a number of guest speakers who share their expertise with us. Among them were Montana's own Jeanette Rankin, who was the first woman in Congress. Another was Charles Lindbergh, the famous pilot. He'd become a strong conservationist. His one son is named Lamb Lindbergh. John Gardner was another one who was invited, and he was really helpful because we wanted to open up the state. And he is a man who founded Common Cause, which promoted sunshine laws. At the time of the convention, Jeanette Rankin was 92 years old, but she was still eloquent. Her talk was so impressive, you could hear a pin drop. During the question period, she was asked what she would do about the tragic Vietnam War that was raging at the time. She firmly stated that she would send the same troop ships and planes that took our young people over there and bring them back immediately. If that had been done at that time, thousands of lives would have been saved. When asked about our voting system, She said she favored eliminating the Electoral College and replacing it with direct primary. We learned a lot from her, but her visit was memorable for personal reasons too. She invited all the women delegates to join her for dinner. It was just the most glorious time. I know that all of us remember it well. I don't have time to talk about each of the remarkable women who served, but there is an article available online which you may view. Of course, there were many outstanding men who served as delegates. It was a glorious time in Montana history. Let us celebrate the first 50 years of Montana's 1972 Constitution and protect its provisions for this and future generations. Thank you.
Your microphone is on, Jerry. It's muted.
Oh, am I okay? Okay. And our next speaker is Delegate Lyle Monroe. And Lyle did live in Great Falls at the time of the convention, but he is now living in Mesa, Arizona. And Lyle is going to introduce us to the Bill of Rights. Lyle.
Hey, thank you, Jerry. I'm glad to be a participant in this session, and I'm really grateful that Great Falls Rising has invited me to be a presenter and to participate in this activity regarding the Montana Constitutional Convention. I was one of the youngest delegates, as you know, and at the age of 24, that was one of the younger group, and some of us are still alive, and the oldest was age 73. This range of experience certainly portrayed the diverse spectrum of the people participating, their experiences and their perspectives. Since 1972, I've remained proud and grateful that Montanans use the rare constitutional revision opportunity to redefine their governmental power structure, to reassess their individual liberties and freedoms. The people of Montana remain grateful to this day for the practical and lasting impact the Constitution had in its Bill of Rights on this great state. The Montana Constitutional Convention was an intense forum, and its product had many features that were imaginative and noteworthy. I'll pass on a few of those in the next few minutes. Many people have covered a lot of territory that I'm covering too, so it's going to be redundant, but I'll try and be very brief too. The first section in Article 2, the Bill of Rights section of the 72 Constitution is called Declaration of Rights. The Article 2 Declaration of Rights. We're speaking of Section 3, and Maynan is going to cover that, some of those provisions in that thing, but I'm going to read all of that Section 3. It's pretty brief. All persons are born free and have certain inalienable rights. They include the right to a clean and healthy environment, the rights of pursuing life's basic necessities, enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and seeking their safety, health, and happiness in all lawful ways. In enjoying these rights, all persons recognize the corresponding responsibilities. So that's Section 3. A lot of important words, a lot of important concepts, a lot of impact. So even though I briefly touched on that Section 3, Maynan, is Bob going to be with us tonight on any presentations at all? Bob Campbell?
No.
Yes, not. Okay. Well, she'll cover it well. And of course, the work that her and Bob did on the preamble is absolutely unbelievable. It's really I call it sacred text. The next section is called individual dignity. It's been referred to already tonight. The dignity of the human is inviolable. No person shall be denied the equal protection of the laws. Neither the state nor any person, firm, corporation, or institution shall discriminate against any person in the exercise of his civil or political rights on the account of race, color, sex, culture, social origin or condition, or political or religious ideas. Section 8. Section 8. The public, it's called the right of citizen participation in Article 2. Section 8 reads, the public has the right to expect governmental agencies to afford such reasonable opportunity for citizen participation in the operation of the agencies prior to the final decision as may be provided by law. Pretty brief, pretty concise, pretty impactful. My wording and comment on this particular section is the citizens of the state of Montana hopefully will continue to access information from agencies and elected officials throughout the decision-making process. This right of citizen participation is essential in affecting practices and oversight regarding governmental policies. This right must be retained for all citizens to ensure the purity of the democratic process. A companion to the right to participation is Section 9, entitled The Right to Know. We as citizens need to know what is going on. And by the way, Mrs. Riker did a great job of speaking about that. So this reads, Section 9, no person shall be deprived of the right to examine documents or to observe the deliberations of all public bodies or agencies of state government and its subdivisions. There's one exception. If there's a private case where there has to be an executive session, this reading covers that, except in cases in which the demand of individual privacy clearly exceeds the merits of public disclosure. So that gives the citizen a great tool to find out what's going on in every agency, in every subdivision of the state of Montana. My next section is really a wonderful section, and it's entitled Servicemen, Servicewomen, and Veterans. So that wasn't in the old Constitution, by the way, that's for sure. So the Mick McEwen out of the Butte Anaconda area was one of the prime sponsors of this particular delegate proposal. And he and others that were veterans, and all the delegates, we all voted on it. And it was overwhelmingly put in Section 35, the last section of the Montana Bill of Rights. So it reads this: the people declare that Montana servicemen, servicewomen, and veterans may be given special considerations determined by the legislature. Fortunately, our Constitution ensures that our Montana servicemen, servicewomen, and veterans are recipients of VA services, of course, regarding healthcare, mental health support, housing needs, etc. Today, 50 years later, after that Constitution became law and of our state, there are over 17 locations where there are what they call community-based, excuse me. There we go. I just have it up. I'm sorry. I'd like to take a moment to share. Many are not aware of Montana VA healthcare system services. Veterans across the largest VA catchment area in the lower 48 states has in Montana 17 community-based out clinics, sites of care for our good veterans, men, women, etc. The great state of Montana, including Fort Harrison VA Hospital is in Helena, and there used to be at one time in Columbia Falls a care home for residents. But there are group homes. There's all sorts of ways that people can access services for veterans and servicemen and women. While this may sound like an adequate amount of medical care, it's not. When you place a clear overhead sheet over the state of Montana map, then it is as big as the northeastern coast. So we have a lot of square miles, 147,000 square miles in the state of Montana, square acres. I believe I have that correct. And one is usually surprised to see that Montana covers almost that whole entire area of the northeastern coast. Our veterans that rely on VA services still must travel great distances and absorb expensive costs for food, lodging, and fuel, etc. The 17 community-based outpatient clinics that strive to meet the needs of our veterans are a blessing, to be sure, but hopefully there will be opportunities for continued growth for the future. So Mike McEwen was farsighted. Mike's last name is spelled McKeon. So he, in his obituary, he is deceased now. So I pay great tribute to him and to all veterans that have served. The strains on families of when the wife is away on a summer camp, when a wife is drawn to a natural disaster here in the state of Montana or somewhere else, or they're over in a foreign country for years from a National Guard unit, or helping in a hospital to make sure that they can help people in this whole COVID crisis that we've had here in the last couple of years. So we honor our military people. They are absolutely unbelievable. And our Shannon, I give a shout out to Shannon Wilson because she knows about 50,000 times more than I know about veterans benefits and being a veteran herself. And she's the one that should be giving this. But I want to just tell you some of the communities, those 17. Anaconda, Billings, Bozeman, Browning, Glasgow, Glendive, Great Falls, Hamilton, Havre, Helena, Kalispell, Lewistown, Miles City, Missoula. These are unbelievable. They have to travel a lot of miles to get some of them, but those, I am so proud that so much of this has happened in the 50 years since our Constitution has been in effect. I'm just really emotional. This and the life and the pro bono work that Mike McEwen did in his legal career and how he gave to his community and his family, just outstanding. Everybody's covered all my closing things, but we know about the alphabetical seating. Absolutely fantastic. We know about the cooperation across the aisles. We know about all 100 delegates signed that document. We know about 120 hearings that people came and testified. We know about children's rights. We know about the legal age for voting is 18. We know about so many things now that helps the great state of Montana be great. And I want to give a shout out to my nice lady here who helped me to get computer literate and do a first Zoom I ever did in my life, Elaine Scowen. And she is really, and her good partner, Dennis, they have helped me learn what a Zoom is. They helped me get out of the cave and I can actually speak in the English language intelligibly. So thank you for your kind attention. Not enough could be said about some of the people, the Harry Mitchells and the Jack, we talked about him before, Jack what?
McDonald.
Jack McDonald. How about our little gal out there in Geraldine? Who was the woman on your group of 19 women?
Glendive.
What was that question?
Rachel.
Louise
Mc-
Cross.
No, Rachel, what's her first name? What?
Mansfield.
Is
Rachel Mansfield.
She
Rachel
wasn't in
Mansfield.
Great Falls District, but she's a
Rachel
shout out. Harry Mitchell's work is right there in your audience. What kind of work they did. Wade DeHood, what kind of work they did. All this came about because people were really important and believable and trustworthy. And Bill and Leo Graybill's use of the Morton's rules of parliamentary procedure. He was an excellent leader in the Constitutional Convention, and he made that thing move on. We would have never done it in 54 days without Leo's leadership. So enough of my stuff. I'm looking forward to listening to a nice lady who helped on the preamble and Clean and Healthful. Good. Thank you very much, League of Women Voters and the University Women and all the people of Montana for voting for such a wonderful document. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lionel. That was really fun to hear about. And fun. I love all the reminiscences. It's just wonderful. And thank you to Elaine for helping you with all this and everything. That was just great. So now we come to the woman who is the youngest delegate in the Constitutional Convention. I think at the age of 27, your children, if I'm wrong. Maynann Ellingson, and she will tell us about the construction of preamble, which is one of the most outstanding in the United States. Maynann?
Thank you. Thank you. Can you, I don't even see myself now. What happened here?
You're there.
We-
You're
You've
there.
got
see
to
you.
put me back on if you can.
You're
You're
there.
on. You're on.
I don't see me,
We
but I
see,
guess that's okay though, huh?
we see you.
Okay, well, fine. Well, hello, everybody, and thank you so much, Jerry, is there something I can do so that people could actually really see that I am here and alive?
We all see you.
We see you.
Oh, you all
See
do?
you well.
Okay, it's just me. Okay, fine.
And you are there. We see you. You just can't see yourself.
All
So
right,
just-
I'm okay. I'm okay with that. I know what I look like, even after 50 years. Bob Campbell, Bob Campbell would always say, well, she was the youngest delegate. And I always said, and I still am. First, how lucky could I have been to sit next to Arlene Reichert at that convention? What an honor and a privilege. And as I look around and see some of the participants, I'm very touched. I see Joe Lamson, who's just been doing the work on the Reapportionment Committee. I see dear Carmen Scari's daughter and brother, and Carmen was one of our amazing delegates. I see Arlene's daughter, and so it's just wonderful. And I see some legislators and others of you, Norma, and people who have worked so hard over the last 50 years to make our state as great as it is. And I just feel honored to be among you. And I feel very honored to have this time to reflect. Over the last 50 years, I reflect on our Constitution quite a bit. And, and I wonder, did we get it right? Yeah, did we get it right? I think for the most part, we did. And I also think we were sensitive enough to know that we might not get it right in everything. And so we made it pretty easy for the citizens of Montana to amend the Constitution or to call another constitutional convention if so needed. I don't think we felt that we were omniscient about everything. And I think that was a remarkable trait about the group of the 100 people who assembled to write this Constitution. The other thing that I think was a remarkable trait is that there was a fundamental belief in democracy, a fundamental belief that people could govern themselves. And, really the underlying thing that girds this Constitution is the beginning of the preamble, we the people, and the fact that all of the power that's derived or granted under this Constitution is derived from we the people. Now, my task is not a hard one in talking about the preamble. That's a place where I think we got it pretty well right. Bob Campbell and I have been given a lot of credit for this beautiful Constitution, and certainly the preamble that finally emerged on the floor of the Constitution most closely reflected the delegate proposal that he and I drafted. But there were other proposals for preambles, I think 4 others in all, and they went to the Bill of Rights Committee chaired by the wonderful Wade DeHood. And it was at that committee where they, wordsmith and looked at all of the preambles the proposals that were submitted, and they ultimately what they suggested and presented to the delegates on the full floor closely resembled what we had written. But there was one notable exception. For the first time that I could remember, although I was still fairly young, there was a real concern and awareness of our heritage, the Native American heritage of our state. And we felt that we wanted to pay some obeisance to that. And so instead of saying grateful to God, our preamble started out grateful to our Creator. But I will read you the whole thing now, so you have in mind what the full delegates approved unanimously. Grateful to God for the quiet beauty of our state, the grandeur of our mountains, the vastness of our rolling plains, and desiring to improve the quality of life, equality of opportunity, and to secure the blessings of liberty for this and future generations, do ordain and establish this Constitution. Mark Roscoe, in his foreword to a book dealing with the Constitution, talks about the preamble by saying, after quoting the preamble, he says, "To me, those words are chock full of hope and pride and love of land, so much so that they should be considered not just a formal preamble to a legal document, but a constant reminder of the meaning of the remaining provisions of the document, a sort of moral and spiritual mooring for the Constitution." And he was so right in that assessment of what the preamble meant to me, and certainly what it meant to the delegates. When others have talked about the environmental situation that was going on nationally as well as in Montana in the late 60s and early 70s. So it was not surprising that almost every single delegate, or a lot of delegates, I should say, I shouldn't overstate things, ran on a platform of protecting the environment in the Constitution. I mean, most of us, or many of us, were very front and center that that was something that we wanted to do. And part of the reason for that was, I'll read to you a passage from K. Ross Toole's book that was published in 1972. And he was talking, about the late 60s. He says, Missoula was often hidden from view by the stinking yellowish gray smog of a pulp plant. The effluent from an aluminum plant in Columbia Falls had yellowed every pine tree for miles around. And the stink of oil refineries in Billings stretched all the way to the town of Laurel. And I know that my own campaign brochure pictured a clear cut on the front, because that was just one of many things happening that we were becoming more and more aware of, as well as the strip mining in eastern Montana. Even though the Bill of Rights comes first, or it's really the first major article in the Constitution, and as Lyle stated, the right to a clean and healthful environment is ensconced there as one of the inalienable rights. It did not start out that way. As the various delegate proposals came in dealing with a right to a clean and healthful environment, water, natural resources, cultural integrity, and so on, those delegate proposals went to both the Bill of Rights Committee and went to the Natural Resources Committee. The Natural Resources Committee was chaired by a truly indefatigable woman from Glendive named Louise Cross. And protecting the environment probably was her sole reason for being at the convention. The natural resources article of the Constitution was debated on the floor, and decided on well before the Bill of Rights was debated on the floor. There was a minority report and a majority report of that committee. Louise Cross felt horrible that she was the only committee chair that did not get a majority report for the strongest, or her report as being the majority report. Her report was the minority report, which in fact was the stronger of the environmental articles. There is not a single provision in our Constitution that was as hard fought or as controversial as the natural resources article. 2 days of debate, 2 days of vote after vote after vote, changing language, changing simple language, changing concepts, lobbying, trying to get 1 or 2 persons to change their vote, whereby, as somebody else pointed out earlier, there was a lot of humor, even on this very, very tough article. I remember kind of 2 things. I think maybe my friend Wade is on this, and I took a very cheap shot at him on the floor, because I was proposing that we added clean and healthful to the words environment. And he says to me, well, Delegate Robinson, if you got this if you were able to secure this right in a constitution, what would you do? And I very meanly said, well, I wouldn't go see you. I'm now a little embarrassed about that, but I have to say the confrontation with the lawyers in the debate on the clean and healthful environment is one of the things that compelled me to go to law school. One of the other kind of funny things that happened, and maybe it was utter shaming that Bob Campbell did, that enabled us to win on the final vote. And everybody, not everybody, but the opponents to this provision in the Constitution were objecting to the words clean and healthful, you know, making arguments. Well, what does that mean? What, you know, it's just, it's indefinable. And, you know, we would make the argument, well, it's not as metaphysical as the word liberty or some of the other words that we use in the Constitution. But we were down to one amendment where it basically said Montanans are going to maintain an environment. They're going to maintain an environment. You know, and Bob Campbell just, what? We're going to maintain an environment. And it was really on that. You're going to go home and tell your voters that you came and said, we're going to have an environment. Well, with that was the final vote that tipped us over to get the article, section 1 of Article 9 that we now have. And let me just simply read it. I'm going to only read you that section, and then I'm going to quickly refer to the other really important things in this article. But section 1, protection and improvement. The state and each person shall maintain and improve a clean and healthful environment in Montana for present and future generations. The legislature shall provide for the administration and enforcement of this duty. And the legislature shall provide adequate remedies for the protection of the environmental life support system from degradation and provide adequate remedies to prevent unreasonable depletion and degradation of natural resources. Now, I think, as Dorothy pointed out, there's a strong provision in here about water rights. Until the adoption of the 72 Constitution, the state of Montana had never claimed its water as a public use. Dorothy then went on to have a very illustrious career as a water court judge and did a yeoman's job in processing these water rights. Very important article. And I do want to, it was a very sensitive topic. The farmers were really instrumental in helping us think this article through. I'm very grateful for their representation there. The other thing that's really important in this, or two other things really that are important, is every land disturbed by the taking of natural resources has to be reclaimed. Prior to this, there was not a requirement that required reclamation. An equally important provision of this article is this setting aside and establishing a priority for cultural resources and directing the legislature to provide for the identification, acquisition, restoration, enhancement, preservation of archaeological, historic, scientific, cultural, and recreational areas for the use and enjoyment by the people. I see my time is just about up, but there are at least 3 takeaways that I want you to all have. The preamble Oh, I did want to mention, so after this hard fought effort to get the natural resources article in the Constitution, Bill Burkhart, in debating, so this happened 2 weeks before March 7th. The Committee of the Whole is debating the Bill of Rights. Bill Burkhart, minister from Helena, moves to add into the inalienable rights provision of the Declaration of Rights to include the right to a clean and healthful environment. So the fact that it's in the Bill of Rights was really an afterthought. And one of the beautiful things about this afterthought is when he discusses it on the floor, he talks about the importance of the preamble and what we were trying to do in the preamble, and that including this in the Bill of Rights was just an important step. And after all of the close and contentious votes on Article 9, this was added to the Bill of Rights on a vote of 79 in favor and only 8 against, which I thought was like, I thought we were going to have to fight the battle all over again, but no. Here are my takeaways. These are all beautiful words. They're important words. Some of them may be self-executing, but what we have to do is we have to hold, what you have to do, what we all have to do is hold political officials' feet to the fire, to take an oath of office to protect this Constitution, and don't do it. We need to elect legislators who take seriously their obligation to implement this Constitution as long as this Constitution is the law of the land. We need to elect governors who appoint people to head of DEQ and DNRC and other departments who take their job seriously in administering the right to a clean and healthful environment. And we need to maintain a strong and independent judiciary that will ultimately make the determination of what these words mean if there is a conflict. And I guess finally, commensurate with that, we need organizations like the League of Women Voters, the Montana Environmental Center, the ACLU. We need groups who are willing to fight for the Constitution when the legislation doesn't work, when the elections don't work, when you finally have to go to court and say, enforce these rights that we have won. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much. If you could know your passion, I mean, being so young at the time, having a sense of humor and the great passion that you provided for the work that was done, we thank you very much. Our next speaker is another delegate, Jean Harbaugh, and Jean is going to relate the hard work of passing the Constitution. And these 100 people went all over the state to do it. So Jean, you're on.
Thank you. Well, I really appreciate Great Falls Rising for bringing this group of people together. It's wonderful to see you all here. And, you know, one of the great things about the Constitutional convention is and was that we were all very close friends by the end of the session, I think, and we have maintained contact with one another over the years and have really come to enjoy each other's presence and work. So, and I would just remind the the folks here today that there is a 8 or 9 volume set of verbatim transcript that records everything that was said and spoken during that convention, and including sex on the floor. So, but it was George Harper who coined the phrase, which became a bumper sticker, "Praise the Lord and pass the Constitution." And praising the Lord turned out to be the easy part, passing the Constitution, not so much. So just as there are a lot of people today who dispute the legitimacy of the past presidential election, there were a lot of people who claimed that the Montana Constitution had not actually been ratified by the public. Following the adjournment of the Constitution, of course, and the signing of the draft by all 100 delegates, within a few weeks, there were 10 of the delegates who announced that they could not support the Constitution when it was came before the public in a referendum. So after the adjournment, the convention appointed 10 delegates, of whom I was one, to inform the public about what was in the document. Bill Burkhart was the chairman of that committee, and so we set about to develop some plans. We had access, we thought, to a $30,000 grant, that federal grant that had been approved to promote the education of the public on this important aspect of government. But those plans were quickly squelched by a lawsuit from disaffected groups within the state that challenged the legitimacy of using federal funds for what they considered to be a partisan proposal. So the question was referred to the Montana Supreme Court, where some of the members had shown themselves not to be terribly enthusiastic about this new constitution. In fact, at one point, they had threatened to disbar Leo Grable from practicing law because of comments that he had made regarding the judicial article. And so when the issue of the legitimacy of the federal grant came before the Supreme Court, the court sided with the plaintiffs and struck down the authorization to use that money in educating the public. What this meant was that that task of informing the public was left to the 100 individual delegates. And it was a momentous task, given the fact that almost no funding was available, and Montana's population, of course, was scattered, as it still is, across the big sky's sprawling expanse. My own district was a 4-county area in the extreme northeastern part of the state, but a total of $2,740 was raised by the contribution of 10 delegates to fund a proposed budget of $26,950. Well, delegates fanned out across the state to speak at forums, to attend civic organizations, access to free radio and television opportunities, to do whatever that was necessary to try to get word out to explain their work. As the June 6th date for the vote drew near, the approval of the Constitution appeared to be doomed. And when the votes rolled in on the evening of the election, that forecast seemed to be confirmed. No votes on the Constitution led the yes votes on the Constitution. But by mid-morning of the next day, the vote count began to turn slightly. And it was not until hours and days later that it was finally announced that the question of approving a new constitution had a majority support. But that wasn't the end of the matter either. Again, legal briefs were filed contending that the new charter had not been approved by a majority of the voters. And the problem was that even though the question of approving the Constitution had received more affirmative than negative votes, it was not clear that a majority of those voting at the election had voted on the document. And this was, the reason for this was that there were 4 boxes to check on the ballot. So the first box was approval or disapproval of the Constitution. That received more votes in favor than against. The second was an option for a unicameral legislature. The third was an option that could be placed in the Constitution, authorizing the legislature to control the issue of gambling in the state. And finally, the exclusion or retention of the death penalty. So not everyone apparently voted on all 4 of those boxes that you could check on the ballot. So there were those who contended that that the Constitution had not received a majority of those voting at the election. Well, once again, the fate of the Constitution then went back to the Montana Supreme Court. And it was not until September of 1972 that the document that Montanans now have was declared to be the state's charter. The 72 draft made changes and consideration of a new constitution much easier by modifying the amendment process and mandating a review of the document by voters every 20 years, has already been alluded to. But in the current political climate, the 72 Constitution of Montana could never have been written or passed. The Convention of 72 was a product of bipartisan efforts and leadership that was dedicated to keeping the focus on the issues. And by letting everyone have a chance to voice their opinions or objections, whatever. Some of the sessions went to the wee hours of the morning. But our Montana Constitution's preamble that opens with those words, "We the people," was written really to ensure the rights of the people, not special interests and not individual preferences. It seems to me that at this moment, our nature is leaning toward the elevation of an individualism over a commitment to our historical social compact. And that drift, I believe, undermines the larger institutional and national well-being. A distinct anti-government sentiment espouses a kind of anarchy rather than democracy that does not bode well, I think, for government for and by we the people. In January of 2020, I was privileged, along with Maine Ann Ellington, to attend the Montana or to attend the United States Supreme Court in Washington to hear the arguments in Espinoza versus Montana. And this was a case that involved the prohibition against giving public funds to religious organizations. It was a distinct pleasure to sit in the US Supreme Court beside Leo Grable's grandson, who was an attorney on that occasion. And the decision that the court issued several months later, it struck down Montana's constitutional prohibition in Article 10 against using public funds to support religious education. The court presumed that there was religious bias in our Constitution in that article. But even though there were 6 clergy, of whom I was one, in that among those delegates, all of whom fully supported the Article 10. And even though the standards of the United States' establishment had to do with the separation of church and state. Plus the fact that more than half of all the states in the Union have nearly identical articles prohibiting the use of public funds for religious purposes. Whatever the future holds, I will always be proud to have participated in this citizens' effort to draft a replacement of the '89 Constitution, which was dominated by powerful interest groups. In our nation, we the people will get, I think, for better or for worse, the kind of government that we deserve.
Jean, thank you very much.
It's from Poplar.
We have
Evidently,
to locate our final delegate, Jerry Lendorf. And he was going to talk about the need for an open and transparent government, but we'll save that now for another time. So don't leave us yet, because we have a surprise coming.
Jerry's here, isn't he?
Did I hear?
Jerry's here. Yeah.
Am I on?
There you are.
Oh, my goodness. Jerry Lendorf will tell us about the need for an open and transparent government. Great.
Thanks, Jerry. I see on the screen I appear under the name Kathy Moore.
Oh, that's the problem.
Uh-oh. Can't hear him.
Can't hear Jerry.
He has to unmute himself, doesn't he?
Trying to find him.
Okay, we're trying, so just bear with us. There are a lot of people for Shannon to go through right now to find Kathy. There.
He unmute?
Yeah, he needs to unmute himself.
He must have.
Am I mute?
Now you're okay. All right, go for it.
Now you're good.
So, thank you, Jerry. We, the people of Montana, you're on the right page here. We, the people of Montana, by ratifying our Constitution in 1972, created a new government. It's a Republican form of government, but not a new form of government for this state. Both the US Constitution and the Montana Constitution of 1989 established Republican form of governments. And probably the reason states establish that type of government is the US Constitution provides that the United States shall guarantee to every state in the Union a Republican form of government. But simply by what we mean by Republican government is one in which the people govern through elections. We, the people, hold the power of government, but elect officers to represent us and serve our interests. There are public servants. In addition to elections, we retain control over government, we the people, by dividing power between the states and the local governments, and then further subdividing that power, at least at the state level, among the traditional three branches of government. We the people also retain the power to amend our Constitution, amend it substantially, or replace it entirely. The point I'm trying to make is we, the people, are not subjects of government. Rather, we're more akin to owners. It's our government. The people we elect are our public servants, and we need to monitor them to be sure they are serving our interests, that they are voting and otherwise acting in accordance with their campaign promises. A weakness of our prior Constitution was that it did not require what we now refer to as transparency in government. Before 1972, it was difficult for the citizen voter to determine what his elected representatives and other government officials were doing with regard to their duties. A citizen often had no idea what action his public servants were taking, or even if they were taking action. Evan Barrett and Bob Brown both noted this lack of transparency earlier. How this lack of transparency was remedied in 1972 is the principal subject of my comments. Changes and additions were made to our Constitution to promote transparency. Changes specific to the legislature were made in the legislative article. Additional provisions with regard to all branches and levels of government were added to the Bill of Rights. Lyle Monroe mentioned them. Well, let me first consider the changes made to the legislative article. Prior to 1972, committees of the legislature typically met in closed sessions, at least when voting on bills. The votes were not recorded. When the committee reported to the floor on that particular bill, the vote was again not recorded. If the bill moved on, or it either moved on or was killed at that point, but if it moved on, there would have been another vote when the bill was publicly debated, referred to as second reading, and the vote again was not recorded. The only recorded vote in the legislatures were the final vote taken on a bill. And at that point, significant amendments could have been made to the bill by unrecorded votes. And okay. Since 1972, Section 10 of Article 5 requires that all sessions of the legislature, including all committee meetings and hearings, be open to the public. Section 11 requires every vote of each member of the legislature on any substantive question, including any voting committee, be recorded and made public. So for the last 50 years, legislators have been subject to public scrutiny. This benefits everyone. It benefits the voter because the voting record is in effect a report card by which he can judge the performance of the candidate seeking re-election. A challenging candidate in an election can take issue with the actual record of his opponent. And an incumbent is benefited by the protection the recorded vote gives. It makes it difficult for someone to misrepresent her position in the legislature. Okay, now let's take a look at the new provisions in the Bill of Rights providing for open government. These provisions apply to all agencies of state government and to county commissions, city councils, school boards. They apply at every level of government. And they're Section 8 and Section 9 of Article 2, Article 2 being the Bill of Rights. Section 8 is labeled the right of participation, and it provides, as Lyle pointed out, the right to expect government agencies to afford reasonable opportunity for citizen participation in the operation of the agency prior to final decision, as may be provided by law. The final phrase of this section, as may be provided by law, indicates that legislative implementation is required and that the section is not self-executing. That is, legislation is required before the right can be enforced. But to the legislature's credit, they provided that legislation. And citizens now may pursue this new right of participation. The legislation requires that each agency develop procedures permitting public participation in in the agency's decisions. Actual and adequate notice must be given of the time, place, and matter to be considered. There must be a reasonable opportunity for people to submit their views at a public hearing. The legislature has also enacted what's referred to as an open meeting law, requiring public bodies of all types and all organizations spending public funds to open their meetings to the public. These public agencies exist to aid in the conduct of the people's business, and their actions and deliberations must be conducted openly. Any public body performing a public function is subject to the open meeting law. A meeting is defined as the convening of a quorum. So if a quorum is present and the public business is discussed, a meeting occurs, and the public must be given notice, access, and the opportunity to participate. The second provision of the Bill of Rights, Section 9 of Article 2, labeled the right to know, is also designed to open government. It provides that no person be deprived of the right to examine documents or observe the deliberations of public bodies or agencies of government, except, as Lyle pointed out, in cases where the demands of individual privacy exceed the merits of public disclosure. This section is premised on the idea that government should be open and subject to public scrutiny. The only exception to the public's right to know is individual privacy, and then only to the extent that individual privacy clearly exceeds the merits of public disclosure. Section 9, unlike Section 8, is self-executing, and legislation is not required to give it effect. A self-executing constitutional provision is one that is immediately effective without the necessary of ancillary legislation. It supplies a sufficient rule by which a right given may be enforced. The right to know is not absolute. It must be balanced against the right of privacy. However, we should note carefully the reading of this section. It provides the right to know does not apply only when the right to privacy clearly exceeds the merits of public disclosure. The addition of the words clearly would indicate that if there's any doubt about whether privacy exceeds the merits of public disclosure in a given case, that the decision should favor disclosure. In the 12 minutes allocated to me tonight, I have tried to show that Montana government is our government, we own it, that the right to participate in it and know what's going on can now be accomplished by individual citizens by utilizing the tools of transparency that have been located in our Constitution since 1972. It is my belief that we, the people, have an inherent duty to utilize those tools to keep our government open. Public trust will come from knowing that public affairs are placed in the public eye. Respect for our government will only occur when the activities of government are visible and when there are ways of checking on what our public officials are doing. Government operates most effectively, most reliably, and is most accountable when it is subject to public scrutiny. Mischief is a companion of secrecy. I believe I reflect the intent of the delegates that when they propose the provisions of the Constitution concerning open government, they deem transparency essential to a democratic republic, that the deliberation and resolution of all public matters must, I repeat, be subject to public scrutiny. It is my further belief that we use these tools of transparency to ensure the concept of American ordered liberty encapsulated in our Constitution remains there. After all, we were warned more than 2 centuries ago that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Thank you.
Much. We realize that open and transparent government is something that all of us desire and certainly hope. Now, don't leave us yet because we've got a little surprise coming, but I do want to thank our convention speakers. We know that we are all much richer for the stories we've heard tonight. Let's keep up the work of preserving this piece of history and continuing the role of our 1972 Constitution. It's worth it for, quote, this and future generations, unquote. I just want to quickly say that check the website, greatfallsrisingmt.org, for credits for the educators, for more events coming up, and also we'll have a recording link on the website tomorrow. So at this point, I have the pleasure of ending this program just as the 1972 Constitutional Convention ended with a special song. Bill Larson of Great Falls, longtime supporter and advocate of music in Great Falls in Montana and founder of the Winds of Montana, will conduct the musical group in one of our favorite songs. Don't hesitate to sing along. Here we go. Everybody stand up and sing. Come on.
Montana, we love you.
And you know what, they're just these.
See, they get to see you. Look at that. Oh, man.
Jerry,
Help preserve and protect
Yes.
money, not country, I had to wrap it.
Close it down.
Jerry, I would just say you would have made a wonderful platoon leader or drill sergeant. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Crowley, Cheryl Crowley, who's that?